The Pentagon calls it lawful defense. Venezuela calls it piracy. And legal scholars, they call it dangerous. One explosion off Caracas now defines how America fights criminals on the water. But what if classifying drug cartels as armed groups blurs the line between law enforcement and war? In this video, we unpack the USS Mason incident, the 10-minute encounter that triggered a new, global argument over what counts as a battlefield. Before we move on, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and like the video. At 2:11 p.m. local time, the destroyer USS Mason tracked a small radar contact 8 nautical miles north of Venezuela's coast. The operations deck was quiet, the sound of machinery steady, as the screen showed the blip move closer, fast, straight, and without identification. It wasn't unusual for civilian vessels to pass through the area, but this one was moving at 45 knots, too fast for a fishing craft and too erratic for a patrol. Contact closing at 45 knots, unresponsive, the log recorded. Standard procedure followed. Hail in English, then Spanish. Broadcast warnings on maritime distress channels. Lights flashed, no reply. The bridge crew watched it on the infrared feed. The shape low and narrow. A go-fast boat known in smuggling routes across the Caribbean. 2 minutes passed. The destroyer's watch officers coordinated over the comms, marking range and bearing. The crew identified 4 individuals on the deck, one appearing to lift a long tube-shaped object. That movement escalated the status from unknown to potentially hostile. Warning, maintain course and identify. Another call transmitted. Still no answer. The Mason adjusted speed, kept its bow pointed off angle to minimize exposure, and maintained rules of engagement. No firing unless a verified threat presented itself. Everyone on deck remained calm, voices clipped and steady, until the radar return showed the boat tightening its approach vector. At 2:21 p.m., 10 minutes after first contact, a flash burst through the camera feed. For a split second, the control room believed the Mason had been hit. The radar echo vanished. Over the radios came the first confused reports. No damage, no impact. Seconds later, visual confirmation from lookout posts revealed a plume of black smoke where the vessel had been. The ship's guns hadn't fired a single round. The explosion came from within the go-fast boat itself. An MH-60R Seahawk, call sign Romeo 21, launched from the Mason and reached the coordinates within minutes. The helicopter circled at 300 feet, its infrared camera scanning the water. The crew confirmed no missile trail, no outgoing fire, no secondary splashes. The wreckage spread wide, fiberglass shards, scorched metal fragments, torn fabric, and 4 life jackets drifting on the waves, none inflated, no survivors. The helicopter crew noted an intact drum floating upright near the stern debris. The feed zoomed in, and the letters were sharp. PDVSA, Petróleos de Venezuela. That single marking disrupted the entire assumption of narcotics trafficking. A fuel drum from Venezuela's state oil company on a supposed cartel boat. Back aboard the Mason, officers wrote initial reports. Explosion originated internally. The deck logs confirmed that rules of engagement were observed, radio calls documented, and no hostile act confirmed. Still, 4 civilians lay dead in international waters, their craft destroyed during an American interdiction mission. It was clear in policy, but uncertain in practice. The operation's objectives called for stopping traffickers. The evidence pointed to something else entirely. The recovered drum suggested the boat may have been moving fuel, not cocaine. In Washington, early briefings to Pentagon officials included 3 competing theories: counter-narcotics enforcement, armed self-defense, or mistaken identity. None aligned neatly with what the Navy data showed. Internal videos and sensor logs confirmed 0 American gunfire. The only detonation source came from the small boat itself. The absence of contraband threw the intent of the encounter into question. Analysts warned that what looked like a quick engagement had opened a gray area in maritime law. Was it a strike, a rescue gone wrong, or the first sign of expanding war logic into law enforcement operations? One officer's line in the after-action summary captured the problem best. Protocol was followed. Result, inconclusive. What began as routine coordination under Operation Marlin Shield now stood as precedent. The Mason's captain complied with orders and international code, Yet the destruction of an unarmed vessel transformed a small interception into a policy dilemma. And while the ocean closed over the wreckage, another kind of fallout began, within defense committees, international courts, and foreign ministries, questioning what the United States had just done. But what came after that blast was even more explosive. An official reclassification that quietly expanded the very definition of war. Operation Marlin Shield, officially launched as a 5-week campaign across the southern Caribbean, centered on intercepting maritime smuggling lanes that cut between Venezuelan and Colombian waters. 4 lethal engagements occurred within its first month, each recorded as counter-narcotics missions under the United States Southern Command. The Navy expanded its patrol grid with destroyers, maritime patrol aircraft, and Coast Guard cutters operating in joint formations. None of this attracted much attention until the USS Mason incident forced a quiet re-evaluation of what kind of mission these ships were truly on. The new statement from the Pentagon arrived just days after that explosion. It reframed the enemy. Drug traffickers were no longer labeled as criminals evading arrest, but as non-state armed groups involved in direct hostilities with the United States. That single classification stripped the previous boundaries separating law enforcement and warfare. Once a group falls under the armed group label, encounters shift from policing operations to law of armed conflict engagements, meaning lethal force can be authorized without the burden of judicial warrants or international courts. According to internal summaries released afterward, this framing gave commanders aboard U.S. ships the right to treat any aggressive smuggler pursuit as an act of war rather than an interdiction. In practice, that meant intercepts no longer required confirmation of contraband before engagement, if imminent threat could be argued. The Pentagon described the policy as an enhancement of defensive posture, emphasizing that any hostile maneuver against U.S. forces qualified as combat. International legal experts, however, pointed out how that interpretation conflicted with Article 2.4 of the United Nations Charter, which prohibits the use of force, except under self-defense or Security Council authorization. Tension deepened when it became clear that Congress had not been fully briefed. Under the War Powers Resolution of 1973, the President must inform Congress within 48 hours whenever armed forces enter hostilities. Yet senior lawmakers reported no prior notification. Senator Mark Warner and others awaited a bipartisan briefing that was abruptly canceled. Questions mounted over whether the operation's reclassification had bypassed the war powers threshold entirely. White House spokesperson Anna Kelly gave no direct answer about whether a response had been submitted to Congress, leaving the legal foundation of the mission uncertain. Outside of Washington, the diplomatic fallout rippled fast. The European Union urged restraint, framing the move as an unnecessary escalation of maritime enforcement. In South America, Brazil requested detailed transparency regarding American vessel movements near its exclusive economic zones. While these reactions carried more political weight than legal power, they highlighted how a single blown-up boat could alter regional trust. For countries balancing energy and security cooperation with both Caracas and Washington, the ambiguity of Marlin Shield's mandate created a sharp dilemma: stand aside or publicly question U.S. authority at sea. When defense briefings finally parsed the language, the Mason incident turned from an isolated mishap into a procedural precedent. Officials cited it as proof that non-state entities in maritime zones could be treated under military parameters if they threatened U.S. personnel or allies. Supporters called it a necessary modernization of counter-smuggling enforcement in an era when traffickers used military-grade weaponry. Critics saw something else entirely: a government edging toward declaring war without declaring one. The Mason's captain had followed the law as written. Now, the law itself had shifted around the act. The Mason walked away from that encounter without firing, yet it left behind a new category of conflict. What began as counter-narcotics now blurs into warfare, and the ocean itself sits between law and combat. America's decision to treat smugglers as armed opponents may offer protection, but it also tests the limits of international restraint. Each engagement writes its own legality at sea, bending the line between defense and aggression. So, when the next radar blip streaks across Caribbean waters at 45 knots, will it be treated as another suspect or the first target in an undeclared war?